What's up, everybody? The Morgile here, back for another video. I had sort of a good deal of fun responding to the last question or comment from one of my subs. So it's a question from Stephen Doss, and it's another one that comes up a lot. It's an important point. Question, just getting right on into it. By the way, I hope y'all are having an extremely stationary and perpendicular to the horizon day. But anyway, the question is hey Morgile, have you or anyone else explained the so-called precession of the equinoxes? For me, it's one of the last things that's nagging me from the globe days, like asteroids and the straight alignments from monument to monument, city to city, and so on and so forth. Thank you for all your research and your video posts, and you're welcome. And thank you so much, Stephen, for the question, comment, and very flattering compliment. So thank you. Now, I appreciate your question, and I will answer to the best of my ability and knowledge and theory. However, I'm a little confused as to how perfectly straight alignments, or in some flat Earth models, it's perfectly curved linear alignments from monuments to monuments across the world, or the ley line grid patterns, which actually do work in both models. But I think that it makes a lot of sense on a flat Earth, while straight alignment between distant monuments on a sphere is literally impossible, as any, quote unquote straight line between distant points would be a chord to the curve of the Earth. So, in other words, the ancient sites all being connected by a grid of lines is absolutely sensible on a flat Earth and makes zero sense on a globular Earth. And I understand that the assumed straight lines are more along the lines of like sea level is an assumed average or mean of the the curved sea on the globe. So I do understand the globular counter argument to all of this. However, I don't assume that sea level is an average mean along the curve of the Earth, but I actually believe the sea is level. And so I believe that the ancient sites are literally connected by straight lines, or possibly curved lines, depending on the matrix that you use. Again, we base a lot of our relative positioning in terms of maps and such on either an azimuthal equidistant projection or a Mercator projection, and that can tend to skew relative sizes and distances, but I digress, as that was certainly not your main question. But on to your main question, which again had to do with the precession of the equinoxes. Much like all the other, quote, proofs of a globe Earth spinning around the cosmos, precession is not exclusive to the Earth being a spinning sphere or the heliocentric model, which is clear in many cases throughout history and can be verified by redundant sources and even general observation and cursory study of astronomy, wherein it was common knowledge that the Earth was stationary and spinning spherical models were just bizarre hypotheses being, sort of debated and kicked around, but also preached and parroted by fringe, imaginative, theoretical physicists of the time, and I call them liaretical hypotheticalists. But that's just me. But in a time of history where manned flight was a laughing matter, electromagnetism was Zeus on a bad day, etc. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with axial precession, but it's simply supposedly a slow regression cycle in the background stars over 26,000 years due to the supposed or alleged axis of rotation of the Earth, essentially regressing in its angle over 26,000 years. Now, a very important point to make in the beginning is that precession, although touted as very accurate and truthful and confirmed, as if they have it all figured out, that's a laughing matter. Now, assuming people have been studying and documenting the cycles of the stars in our current known history for, say, 5,000 years, And that's being very generous. And just for a round number, we'll say that people have been documenting and studying the stars for that we can find documents for say 5,000 years. And again, that is generous to the mainstream narrative. But even 5,000 years is about 20% of the entire alleged 26,000 year cycle, which is precession or axial precession, which causes the precession of the equinoxes, allegedly in the globe Earth model. Now, I realize the logic behind the extrapolation. In other words, they claim that they can study this cycle, this 26,000 year cycle for a few hundred years, and then they can extrapolate out the rest of the 26,000 year cycle based on calculations. But forgive me if I'm missing something here. Wouldn't a culture of people actually need to study these cycles over at least 26,000 years to realize there was indeed a cycle? Or possibly even 52,000 years to confirm that it is a cycle? Um, this leaves me wondering how modern astronomy can claim to have figured out the precession of the equinoxes, or rather verified the precession of the equinoxes, without even a fraction of one complete cycle, which is technically impossible. And again, I do understand the extrapolations that they make, but I think it's far more likely that pre-ancient, pre-diluvian, before the Great Flood told of in all ancient cultures, there were these civilizations that were diligent watchers of the stars, whatever the stars are, but they were diligent watchers and documenters of the stars for possibly tens of thousands of years, and were able to confirm that cycles such as precession occur. Just as an analogy, this would be sort of like having to find the pattern of numbers. The old IQ test games or brain mind puzzles where they'll show you a series of numbers. For example, 2, 4, 6. What's the next number? Obviously, that's going to be 8, but some of these get sort of complex. But as an analogy, this would be sort of like showing someone the first number in a series, and after they showed you that first number, someone claiming that they could know the following pattern based on logic and trends, which is, it's impossible. It's ridiculous. It's simply impossible to be aware of a cycle or an unknown event, or at least confirm a cycle, without first witnessing the cycle once and then verifying it a second time. So I think it's far more likely that some degree of hidden knowledge remains kept in the hands of a few plutocrats who are bred to ensure their secretive brotherhood always has an upper hand on the common Joe, and will lie, cheat, and steal because we give them full permission, including registering our cars and children to the king. Regis means king, and when you register something, you're agreeing that the property belongs to the king, to the regis, and you are merely granted use of it until deemed otherwise. This is why they can tow your car you own outright. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the king. Okay, so back to the point. Just as an analogy, so that you sort of understand where I'm coming from here, imagine this would be sort of like having someone who's not familiar with, our solar system, for lack of a better phrase, and is not familiar with the seasons, and is not familiar with the analemma, for example, of the sun. Now, let's just say that that person does understand, everything about astronomy except for what the sun does in terms of seasons and the analemma. Now, imagine if that person claiming to predict what's going to occur in terms of the entire path of the sun from Capricorn to Cancer and back, along with the analemma and all, just by witnessing, say, the first month and a half of the cycle. So that would be technically impossible for them to do. And so, similarly, it's really sort of impossible for modern science to claim to have verified the so-called precession of the equinoxes when at maximum we've been studying only 20% of it, of one cycle. Again, you'd have to go through 52,000 years of observation to confirm that it's a repeating cycle. So at least 26,000 years to confirm that it's a cycle. Although, again, I do understand the extrapolations that they use to uh, sort of predict it as a cycle, but I just think it's a little bit naive to say that we know for sure what's going to happen over 26,000 years, let alone 52,000 years, when we've really only been documenting this sort of thing for 5,000 years. Anyway, now another quick thing to point out, because I did mention that there may be this hidden brotherhood who keeps certain knowledge in the hands of a few plutocrats. I've got a little news flash for everyone, but nobody lives 26,000 years. So technically, there's no way for anyone to confirm or verify, how we're entering the age of Aquarius. That's sort of the agreed. We're moving out of the age of Pisces and into the age of Aquarius, which is all astrological garbage as far as I'm concerned. Although there may be something to it, but all it is it has to do with where the stars are in the ecliptic when the sun rises on the equinox or whatever. But we're exiting the age of Pisces and we're entering the age of Aquarius. And for some reason, people tend to think that the age of Pisces is somehow a reflection of the age of Jesus. And now we're entering the age of Aquarius, which is the age of, the outpouring of knowledge or the outpouring of water. We all know what Aquarius is, but this is all astrology. This is all esoteric occultism, and all of this astrology and esoteric occultism has been supplanted into Christianity, specifically by the Roman Catholic Church. So there's no sort of connection to the age of Pisces and Jesus. This is essentially occultists who have merged Christianity with the pagan mystery religions. And that's why we have things like Easter and Christmas. Of course, they juxtapose that with the birth of Jesus and the crucifixion and resurrection in terms of Easter. But Easter on the spring equinox, again, is the worship of Ishtar, the pagan spring fertility goddess, where they would dye eggs in the blood of a sacrificed virgin who was conceived 9 months earlier. So, lots of bizarre things that were sort of supplanted or sort of incrementally over time merged with Christianity, which I think Christ would be furious. I mean, he was all about teaching people. He was all about showing people, or showing by example. He was very much against, churches or the Pharisees. Essentially, not really having faith in their holy books, and really using their positions of power and influence to get over on people and control people. So ultimately, I think that Christ was anti-establishment and certainly anti-established religion. I mean, if there's anything that you take away from the Bible, I think it would be that. Now, of course, Christ knew his Bible, and which would have been the Torah, and he knew the religion, and he followed the religion, and he followed the commandments, and he observed the sacred dates. But that's not the point. The point is he certainly wouldn't have been for a Catholic Church who worships idols and claims to be the vicars of Christ on earth and take confessions in a little booth. I think that confession should be done to the person that you have done wrong to. You should try to make amends. That's what confession should be, I think. I don't think confession should be, stealing from people and or whatever, or doing people wrong, and then feeling a lot better about yourself because you told some priest that you're never going to see again, and he's never going to tell anybody. So, and if you believe that's works, and that's to each his own. But I think that the far more effective and actually honorable thing to do would be to confess, apologize to the person that you've done wrong to, and somehow repay them. But that's just me. Anyway, for modern science to claim to know the full precession of the equinoxes will occur, it's sort of like seeing the first number in a series of random numbers, or a series of some type of successive numbers that are predictable once you've seen the first three or five numbers in the series. That would be like science claiming to know what the full pattern would be after seeing the first number. So, again, it's simply impossible to be aware of a cycle or an unknown event without witnessing it and verifying it. Now, I think it's far more likely that some degree of hidden knowledge remains kept in the hands of a few plutocrats who are bred to ensure their secretive brotherhood always has an upper hand on the common Joe. Again, they will lie, cheat, and steal because we give them full permission, including registering our children to the king. And I did mention this just a second ago. However, these multi-generational families have an agenda that spans many generations. Honestly, I don't even know my great grandfather's first name on my father's side. I never met him. And in fact, I did meet my great grandmother on my mother's side. She was alive when I was very young, but I don't remember her name. But you've literally got these very wealthy lineages, these royal lineages, who have not been sort of broken up and family lines scattered to the winds throughout history, but they've kept their bloodlines very pure in their eyes, even to the point of inbreeding, which is why you have so many funky looking royals, is because they literally cousin loving cousin sort of thing. So it is kind of bizarre. Uh, but they certainly do stick together. They watch each other's backs. They treat each other like family, so they look out for each other, and they make sure that as long as the family is happy and working together and taken care of, that they can accomplish a lot more because they've got more people who are, essentially 100% loyal and 100% trusted and trustworthy. Now, that is within the family, including things like the mafia or even the Vatican, but especially these, royal families. Now, I did mention before, when you register something, you're signing it over to the king. This is why they can tow your car. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the king. And if Child Protective Services deems you unfit, they can legally kidnap your children and place them in a strange, federally secure environment because you signed a certificate of live birth and registered your child to the federal government, which literally means that your child is owned by the King of England. Okay? Now, you think that's crazy? Look up the Sestui KV Act of 1666. You own a fictitious character or a corporation. That is your child. That is what you own. You own a fictitious corporation that's on a piece of paper. And while you do physically have your child and take care of them, technically you have signed your child over to the state when you register your child. So just saying. And again, I do urge people to, don't just listen to me. Research the Sestui KV, or some people call it Sestui Kai Vi Act of 1666. I think it's CESTUIQUEVIE, but I'll put it up on screen so we've got it, so whatever. But, 1666. Shouldn't be too hard to find. Um, So yeah, in return, you get a birth certificate. However, this belongs to a fictitious person, a corporation set up in place of your newborn child, and unless you take proper action or simply do not register your child and avoid the newfangled vaccinations however possible. I'm telling you, these vaccinations, you want to keep your children away from that. Doesn't matter how much they threaten. I'm sorry, but they cannot force uh, needles and vaccinations onto our children. I believe it is spreading things like hepatitis C. Staph infection is always a big deal, but they could actually, the children can actually catch what they're supposed to be being vaccinated against. Not to mention the mercury. I mean, vaccinations are something that you definitely want to stay away from unless there's something that's been on the market and are known not to cause issues for 50 years. And just, as a note to self, if I ever do have a child in the United States, I am not going to register them or, I guess things like smallpox vaccinations and that sort of thing might be okay. I don't know. I really don't know. We've seen, in America, all the medical advances that we've supposedly made in the last, say, 50 or 100 years, I've seen Americans' health decline to the point, and this is obviously because it's very profitable for the medical industrial complex to have a bunch of sick, unhealthy people. So that's the broad spectrum reason why we've got so many sick, unhealthy people is because, well, it's good for business. So, at any rate, don't ask me why I always end up on some sort of a tangent, but it's important, so back on point yet again. The stars apparently make a full circuit overhead every 24 hours, just like the sun and just like the wandering stars. However, each of the said sets, the stars, the sun, the moon, the wandering stars, each of these objects or sets of objects, they travel at slightly different rates, apparently, which gives us things like the sidereal day versus the solar day, and of course, the moon's monthly so called orbit, which again is a transit across the background stars every month. Now, in the heliocentric model, it is we who are spinning, obviously, and the distant stars are essentially stationary relative to one another. However, the wandering stars, or the planets, show long term regression patterns. For example, Jupiter, which takes 11.86 years to make a full quote unquote orbit, or a full recession through the sky in relation to the background stars, slowly, night after night, year after year, it will eventually make a full circuit, but absolutely orbits the center every single night, just at a slightly different speed than the background stars. Now, the heliocentric model claims this is because the little light is orbiting the sun over the years, but that is nothing more than pseudoscience and conjecture. The wandering star Jupiter is not orbiting the sun every 11.86 years. Instead, it's orbiting the magnetic center in the north, according to the azimuthal equidistant projection, in concentric rings around a layer of the astral plane every night, just like the sun and moon and stars apparently do, but slowly regresses in a full cycle over every 11.86 years. Looking at timekeeping methods dating back to ancient Maya and other cultures long in the past, possibly what we might call pre-Diluvian, or before the fabled Great Flood, or at least before the last ice age, if such a thing actually occurred as they say, which I cannot personally confirm or verify. I've only been around 30 some odd years, but there appears to be actually 35, just in case you're wondering, not 33. But there appears to be a decent geological evidence for such a thing in the last several thousand years. Keep in mind, the Maya were removed in time and space from the Greeks, the Egyptians, Arabians, Sumerians, etc., by supposedly insurmountable distances, and often existed in completely different time frames, although many ancient cultures were aware of precession long before a spinning sphere Earth was ever even theorized. Certainly, long before a widely accepted the Maya were very keen observers of the heavens, and the cycles they were aware of were very meticulously tracked, which is mimicked in most ancient cultures across the world. Now, could they be following in the footsteps of some unknown pre-ancient, prehistoric civilization that might have spanned the entire world at one point, ostensibly with at least 26,000 years to develop their culture? Now, for one thing, the fact that we even know about precession based on many thousands of years of observation, at least to confirm it, it would take 26,000 years minimum to verify that the cycle is indeed a cycle, and another 26,000 years to verify that the cycle is actually a repeating cycle. So I understand witnessing a fraction of a cycle and extrapolating the remainder, but to originally discover such a cycle and confirm it with certainty, and even experience the cycle twice to ensure that it is indeed a repeating cycle. One thing I'll mention is that perfectly repeating cycles in the heliocentric model are so laughable and impossible, it's really rather irrelevant to entertain any idea involving a heliocentric model when you have such perfectly repeating cycles. However, most people believe it's true, so it's our job to show them the truth and how perfectly repeating cycles are just simply not possible in the spinning globe heliocentric model. Now, I love my job because I care about people and the truth, honestly. I strongly believe the ancient pyramidal sites, including possibly Giza and Peru and South America and Bosnia, Crimea, China, the Grand Canyon, I believe, everywhere on Earth you'll find ancient, massive monoliths and even very massive, mysterious pyramids all over the world. These essentially indestructible structures or backup data, in quotes, to help mankind recover from any such worldwide cataclysmic disaster, possibly involving a worldwide flood told in legends of all ancient cultures in one form or another, often mimicking or at least echoing the story of Noah, although these cultures were removed by many hundreds of years, thousands of miles of allegedly virgin seas. And so, a major disaster, including a great flood, for one example, could have eradicated most of humankind, along with some prehistorical, technologically advanced society that had 26 to 52,000 years or maybe longer to develop their technologies. I mean, look at what we've done in the last 100 years. Could you imagine if you had 20,000 or 50,000 years to develop technology? In order to confirm the cycle completely, it could have taken 52,000 years of celestial astronomical observation to confirm the cycle with 100% certainty. But again, I'm not ignorant of the way that they use extrapolation methods to estimate precession and project precession over a 26,000 year period. However, there still is conjecture involved here in place of measurement that would take many, many, many generations to confirm, even a quarter of a cycle, let alone a full cycle. So let's not even get into the solar orbital cycle, And by the solar orbital cycle, I mean the sun supposedly going around the galactic center, which supposedly takes about 250 million years. I'm sure a scientist or two has been around studying and documenting the sun's orbit around the galaxy for hundreds of millions of years. Sure they have. Now, the fact that precession was well known and documented by geocentrists prior to the postulation, and especially prior to the mainstream acceptance of the preposterous and laughable heliocentric model, this all flies in the face of the modern timelines and claims that precession is somehow exclusive to a long term wobble in our alleged hypothetical non existing axis of rotation. Now, it's no secret that Rome, or the Vatican as we call them these days, has made it their institutional goal to wipe out ancient knowledge and all cultural knowledge that indeed, I believe, holds a great deal of truth passed down through verbal and written traditions. Now, this makes perfect sense to me because Rome, aka the Roman Catholic Church, has made it their number one mission to destroy ancient knowledge, specifically that pertaining to cultures who probably kept remnants of important astronomical knowledge in safekeeping. For example, giant mysterious pyramids scattered across the world, which is exactly why I believe Egyptologists call them tombs. They call the Great Pyramids tombs, even though not one single hieroglyph or mummy was ever found in any of the Great Pyramids. As well as the Library of Alexandria, the pyramids in Alexandria were destroyed by Rome, who probably hoarded the ancient scrolls, which allegedly included countless volumes of unique scientific and astronomical observation, possibly even leftover technology and documentation dug up from some pre Diluvian civilization, which has not been 100% proven. However, the baffling pyramids and other such super mega structures of ancient times seem to tell a tale of a highly advanced civilization in the distant past. So distant indeed, we don't even know who built the pyramids, and even though it appears the Egyptians, they claim to have built them, but it seems that they may have merely stumbled upon the ancient sites, which were already ancient in the time of the ancient Egyptians, and these pyramids already existed prior to them stumbling upon them. And so they set up shop, and it gave them an opportunity to claim demigod status because of their awesome, unprecedented, and unreplicated Great Pyramids. This would also provide the motive for the Vatican to totally decimate the Mayan and Egyptian cultures and histories, amounting to millennia of careful observations and documentation of, astronomy and really who knows what sort of technologies or knowledge they had, that may never be recovered unless perhaps the entire city of the Vatican is raided and the entire world gets to look through all of their documents and crypts and all the skeletons in their closet. That would be great, but it'll never happen because the Vatican is one of the three major power centers for the Illuminati. You have obviously Washington, D.C., which is a citadel or it's its own nation state. It's a city within a city, essentially. But Washington, D.C. has its own laws, it has its own police force, its own constitution. Washington, D.C. is a district of Columbia, it's not part of America. So that's the sort of the war arm of the Illuminati. Then you have the Vatican, which is sort of the religious arm of the Illuminati. It's also one of these citadels, a city within a city with its own laws, own constitution, own police force, own zip code. But they also, they would be the religious or rather satanic arm of the Illuminati. And finally, you have the City of London. Now, I'm not talking about London, but the City of London, which is yet another, the third of the trifecta citadels. It's a city within a city with its own laws, its own constitution, which is the financial arm of the Illuminati. So, this sort of God, ugh, I can't believe I just said that. This worldwide trifecta of evil who have us covered on all fronts. I mean, they've got it covered spiritually, they've got it covered monetarily, and they've got teeth behind it in terms of the, United States, in terms of DC, they've got the force behind it. So essentially, that's what they've been building up to all of these years. This is some sort of three-headed beast with many horns, if you will. Um, the globe Earth has been a theory and a never ending mission to convince the rest of the world of its non absurdity by the globe holes for what they claim to be about 2,300 years, as it was allegedly first hypothesized that the Earth revolves around the Sun by Aristarchus of Samos as early as the 3rd century BC. However, Ptolemy was accurately predicting the so called orbit of Jupiter about 11.86 years for the orbit of Jupiter, and in the year around 100 AD. So it was allegedly a couple hundred years after Aristarchus. But Ptolemy was accurately predicting the so-called orbit of Jupiter using a geocentric model. Now, furthermore, we should also discuss Ptolemy's predecessor, Hipparchus, and the source on this is Wiki. Now, there is still controversial evidence that Aristarchus of Samos possessed distinct values for the sidereal and tropical years as early as 280 BC. The discovery of precession is usually attributed to Hipparchus, who lived 190 through 120 BC, which is about 100 years after Hipparchus, but the discovery of such precession usually is attributed to Hipparchus, which was again about 190 to 120 BC. And Aristarchus was the one that thought the Earth revolved around the Sun in around the 3rd century BC. So essentially, Hipparchus and Aristarchus were more or less contemporary. I mean, it's really hard to say. Maybe I could research a bit more, but they were around it. It was being debated for sure. It's not like it was widely accepted that the Earth was a globe spinning around, back then, 2,300 years ago, using geostationary models and discovering things like the so-called orbits of the wandering stars. By the way, Hipparchus is sometimes attributed to having his work released as early as 280 BC, and the discovery of precession is usually attributed to him. According to Ptolemy's Almagest, Hipparchus measured the longitude of Spica and other bright stars, comparing his measurements with data from his predecessors, Timachares, 320 to 260 BC, and Aristillus, around 280 BC. Now, he concluded that Spica had moved 2 degrees relative to the autumnal equinox. He also compared the lengths of the tropical year, the time it takes the sun to return to an equinox, and the sidereal year, the time it takes the sun to return to a fixed star, and found a slight discrepancy. Now, Hipparchus concluded that the equinoxes were moving or precessing through the zodiac, and that the rate of precession was not less than 1 degree in a century. In other words, completing a full cycle in no more than 36,000 years. Although I think it's modern astronomy claims that the full precession of the equinoxes is 26,000 years. I will note that this is a major assumption that cannot be confirmed without tens of thousands of years to confirm the cycle, as opposed to making a single observation and extrapolating or essentially assuming that the rest of the cycle, and even in 10 lifetimes, you wouldn't notice much of a difference in the so called precession of the equinoxes in either a globe or a flat model when you're talking about the equatorial stars. This would be like an astronomer with no understanding of the seasons to assume after 1 month that the sun was going to make a longitudinal path all the way up to Cancer and then 6 months later return to Capricorn and a lemon and all after just a single month of a first time observation of the sun. In other words, you must see a complete cycle of anything that's natural and random until you've confirmed the cycle. But you must see a complete cycle of anything to confirm that it is indeed a cycle. And really, you need to witness the cycle twice to verify that it is indeed a repeating cycle. And so, my point of contention is that it would take an observer at least 2 years to discover the sun's apparent pass from Capricorn to Cancer and back over the course of a year, as well as the analemma. And it would take him another year to confirm that it's a repeating cycle. Um, but there's no possible way, I don't care how smart you are or how great of an astronomer you are, if you've never heard of the seasons or the analemma, there's no possible way that you could extrapolate what the sun is going to do over a full year based on a single month of observing the sun. And that's essentially what's going on with this so-called precession of the equinoxes. Globers assume it's due to the tilt, that 66.6 degree tilt of the Earth, sort of spinning around like a top over 26,000 years. But again, that it is all assumption. Nobody has been studying the stars and documenting them for 26,000 years, let alone 52,000 years to confirm that it is indeed a repeating cycle. So there is a lot of conjecture here, and I just wanted to point this out because it is a big. People try to use precession of the equinoxes as proof of a globe for some reason. For one thing, it's not exclusive to a globe, and for another thing, the entire cycle has never ever been verified. It is just, it's a fairly well founded theory that needs to be proven, and you're probably going to have to wait another 20,000 years to verify it, but I digress. Now, in terms of precession of the equinoxes, although they are not exclusive to the spinning globe Earth, the major problem I have is with Polaris. Now, Polaris in the heliocentric model is supposedly 433.8 light years away, or about 2.5 quadrillion miles. Now, I'm not even going to try to explain or put anything to scale that's 2.5 quadrillion miles away. The thought that you could possibly ever imagine that or wrap your brain around it is ridiculous. First of all, light years are just theoretical. I don't think such distances even exist. We understand what light speed is, and I understand that if light could travel in a straight line for a year, then that would equate to a distance. But this is a major point of contention for me in terms of Polaris. Polaris is unique amongst all the other stars. Even though the equatorial stars, which define the age or define the position in our current cycle of precession, the equatorial stars, for example, will precess over tens of thousands of years. based on extrapolation and not based on documented measurements over 26,000 plus years or even 52,000 years to confirm the repeating cycle. Unless that wisdom, which was lost in the Great Flood, fabled in all ancient cultures, may have been sort of picked up and hoarded by well, let's just say Rome or the Roman Catholic Church, or whatever you want to call that entity that is still Rome to this day. Maybe you could call it Washington D.C., but the idea still remains, or the ideals. The problem with Polaris has to do with the fact that it has remained fixed directly over our North Pole, the supposed axis of rotation, for hundreds of years, or hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, which is totally impossible given the known facts about precession. The hypothetical axis of rotation should be changing 1 degree every 100 years or so, although 1 degree every 100 years doesn't seem very impressive when you're dealing with an alignment with our alleged non-existing axis of rotation. The 2.55 quadrillion plus mile distant Polaris would be so many light years out of line, even over a fraction of a degree in change of that axis, or assumed axis of rotation. Now, I'll also mention that even though, let's just say that this precession of the equinox travels 1 degree over 100 years, it's not like it stays in one place and then clicks over a degree after 100 years. It's going to slowly phase through that degree over the 100-year period. So it's constantly going to be changing, constantly, ever so slowly, but it's not like 100 years, click a degree. Another 100 years, click a degree. Once 25 years have gone by, then it's going to have precessed 1/4 of a degree, and so on and so forth. Now, this chart, just to give an example, shows how a 2 degree angle, because I don't have my monitor, and I don't think anybody has a monitor that is 2.55 quadrillion miles long. So just to give you sort of a compressed example, this chart shows a 2 degree angle. However, I can assure you that even a 0.5 degree or half a degree or even 1/4 degree angle, when extended over 2.5 trillion miles, would amount to an enormous divergence from the baseline. The baseline's in black. That's a perfectly horizontal line. And the red line is a divergent, 2 degree divergent line from the baseline. Now, I think another important point to make is regarding those who claim buildings shouldn't appear to lean laterally on a sphere when viewed from a distance. If a cityscape is, say, 60 miles away, and you can see, say, 100-mile stretch of cityscape across the water, 50 miles on each side of directly in front of you. Or even say it's a 50-mile stretch of cityscape with 25 miles. We can do the math on either or, but the skyscrapers directly in front of you or directly in your line of sight, call that skyscraper the primary building. It should appear perpendicular or perfectly straight up and down. However, the building, say, 25 miles to your left, which would only appear to be a few feet to your left from the primary building off in the distance from your perspective, Globbers argue the small amount of curvature over 50 or 100 miles would amount to such a small angle of difference between the two skyscrapers, 50 or 100 miles apart, based on what I believe are faulty mathematics. Assuming the city is a level surface, which San Francisco would be a bad place to do this, but New York is sort of a good idea, and there are other cities that are relatively flat. They are planned that way. In fact, New Orleans is built below sea level, which is kind of silly. But assuming the city is a level surface, there should be, in this example that I'm giving, there should be a 25-mile curve on either side of the primary building. Or, I'm sorry, a 25-mile long curve downward on either side of the primary building. And the theoretical sphere having a radius of about 4,000 miles. Now, let's say the two buildings, 50 miles apart, 25 miles laterally distant from the primary building to the left, and the other one 25 miles laterally distant from the primary building to the right. Have a medium point between the two where you're standing, only, say 60 miles away. And that medium point is the primary building. So there's a 25-mile long decline on either side of that primary structure. Now, that decline on both sides of the skyscraper would curve down, according to you, on both sides, and the distant buildings, again, one 25 miles to the left, the other 25 miles to the right, should both be 416 feet lower than the primary structure, or at least the base of those buildings should be 416 feet lower than the primary structure, according to your point of view. Now, if you were standing directly across from the building on the far right, then there should be a 1,666 foot downward curvature towards the building on the far left, and vice versa. Now, globbers argue that this amount of curvature is not noticeable by the naked eye, even though many miles in human terms are in play. Not many miles are involved with the globe as a whole. But remember the slide about angles? The math done to disprove, quote, leaning buildings on the globe Earth assumes the center of axis to be the face of the Earth, when in fact, the center of axis is actually 4,000 miles beneath the foundation of each building. So again, even a 1 or 2 degree divergence from apparent level is extended out 4,000 miles. Then we're not talking about some small distance at the end of that angle. Do the math. Let's say you extend a half a degree angle over 4,000 miles. How far off baseline would it be? What about 2 degrees over 4,000 miles as the radius of curvature? Do you think we'd be talking about a small divergence or a large divergence? Just a question. Who knows how many millennia such a hypothetical pre-Diluvian culture existed, but it apparently had vastly superior technology, which has ostensibly survived a worldwide flood, as well as many thousands of years of erosion and looting, etc. I find it highly plausible that the modern ancient civilizations, I guess I should say modern quote unquote ancient civilizations, aka the post-Diluvian cultures such as Egyptian or possibly even Sumerian, found remnants of this pre-ancient or pre-Diluvian civilization, who apparently built these supermassive structures specifically to track time, or possibly as some type of energy conduits, or even an assurance that as our future culture advanced, we would make good use of the knowledge they left behind, which has been picked clean ostensibly by the likes of the Vatican or Rome in general. Throughout history, it has always been Rome who assimilated any culture they conquered into Roman culture, which is how Rome survives to this day under the clever guise of the Vicars of Christ on Earth, or the Vatican, but also via more nefarious arms of the Catholic hierarchy, for example, the Jesuits or the Society of Jesus, who now run the very top position at the Vatican as opposed to just giving the Pope his marching orders from behind the scenes, as they typically have done throughout the ages. Now, I should also mention that America is really nothing more than an extension of Rome, and other cultures assimilated into it because again that's how Rome rolls and that's how Rome rules. They do rule over people, but they allow them to sort of keep their cultures, which makes them feel like they're not being ruled, but essentially they are consolidated and folded into the power of Rome. And people say that Rome fell when they were raided by the Huns because they were spread too thin. However, I think that Rome merely spread worldwide. And, obviously there's cultures out there that have not assimilated with Rome. But America certainly ain't one of them. Now, I suppose Pope Ratzinger, the Hitler Youth and blind eye pedophile at best, didn't hurt the current black pope from seizing power using probably blackmail as leverage to assure the whole white smoke thing went up for the current pope, who could very well be the last, according to prophecy, least of which involving Fatima, which is another topic altogether, and of course, possibly a hoax or a cover up to some extent or another. Virtually all the writings of Hipparchus are lost, including his work on precession. They're mentioned by Ptolemy, who explains precession as the rotation of celestial sphere around a motionless Earth. It is reasonable to presume that Hipparchus, similar to Ptolemy, thought of precession in geocentric terms as a motion of the heavens rather than that of the earth. Now, just a little background into these two characters, and again, I'm sourcing Wiki on this. It can be a decent source sometimes. Ptolemy, he was the first astronomer known to have continued Hipparchus's work on precession. Ptolemy in the 2nd century measured the longitudes of Regulus, Spica, and other bright stars with a variation of Hipparchus's lunar method that did not require eclipses. Before sunset, he measured the longitudinal arc spreading the moon from the sun. Then, after sunset, he measured the arc from the moon to the star. He used Hipparchus's model to calculate the sun's longitude and made corrections for the moon's motion and its parallax. Evans, 1998, pages 251 through 255. Ptolemy compared his own observations with those made by Hipparchus, Menelaus of Alexandria, Timarchus, and Agrippa. He found that between Hipparchus's time and his own, about 265 years, the stars had moved 1 degree in about 72 years. He also confirmed that precession affected all fixed stars, not just those near the ecliptic, and his cycle had the same period of 36,000 years as found by Hipparchus. Precession was historically called precession of the equinoxes because the equinoxes moved westward along the ecliptic relative to the fixed stars. Opposite to the yearly motion of the sun along the ecliptic, the discovery of the precession of the equinoxes is mostly attributed in the west to Hellenistic area or 2nd century BC astronomer Hipparchus, although there are all alternative suggestions claiming earlier discoveries such as Indian text Vendaga Jyotisha from 700 BC, all of whom used a geocentric model to discover so-called precession and explained it adequately using a very simple explanation, much like everything else in the truth-based earth sciences, instead of the dogmatic-based sciences who have vouched to never ever consider our world special, unique, or the primary centerpiece of the so-called universe, which the Earth absolutely is, all that and then some. Instead, these guys want our world to be an insignificant
Sitting sphere.
flying around in space with basically no future except for ultimately at the end of this goat rope, we have a dead planet orbiting a dead star flying through space with no meaning to any of it. in the grand scheme of things, when that is exactly the opposite of what's going on our large, wonderful, mysterious, beautiful, awesome, stationary plane world. Now, on the other hand, Ptolemy, so to answer the question, it is my contention that precession, while credited by modern sources as being discovered around 150 BC to 300 BC, or at least described by Ptolemy around 100 AD, who was a well known geocentrist. This predates, and there are other geocentrists familiar with precession, predating the heliocentric model by many hundreds of years. And it was actually well known many thousands of years prior to Copernicus or Newton. The notion that precession is somehow exclusive to a spinning spherical Earth is preposterous, yet typical when dealing with globers. Um, so I really do appreciate that post from the original poster, Stephen Doss. So thanks so much for inspiring me for the concept. Thanks so much for the comment, and hopefully I'll help you to show you how this works in a geocentric flat Earth model as well as a heliocentric model. So in other words, it's not exclusive to a globe. And then maybe you can get them to eat their socks, and preferably wool socks. Since we get to pick the materials, I was thinking maybe even Eskimo socks. 78% natural sheep wool, 20% nylon and 2% elastine. Perfect fitting, top quality, and extra warm. Notice one of the manufacturers is Dick, so I think we can pick the manufacturer as well. So yeah, you can get your globe Earth friends who think that precession is exclusive to a spinning sphere Earth to eat their socks, and you can pick the material and the manufacturer. Ain't it grand? So, now, of course, lyrical hyperbolists have a tendency to build their models upon assumptions, which is fine for an argument's sake. However, at some point, it's necessary to validate or double check or possibly falsify any of these assumptions propping up the globe model. Now, if even one such pillar of the Earth's assumed properties is falsified, then the entire model has been falsified. So, for example, if the Earth has no curvature or no axial rotation or neither, then we do not have a spinning sphere because obviously you cannot have a stationary plane also be a spinning sphere at the same time. Therefore, the entire heliocentric model has been debunked on two basic fundamental premises that have been assumed. However, when you try to verify the assumption, it is indeed falsified. And it's preposterous to expect one to continue disproving the theory of gravity as a warping of space-time, just as one example, because the theory of gravity hinges upon the Earth being a spinning sphere, which it is not. Now, again, it's okay to accept an assumption for argument's sake, to test a theory. That's perfectly legitimate. That's how science works. However, any assumption must, at some point, be proven or verified or at least demonstrated. When you have a model built upon assumption after assumption after assumption and deem it beneath your craft to prove said assumptions, then you're no longer a scientist but an author of science fiction and even fantasy. And we certainly have run into this problem for at least the last three generations, probably for the last 500 years or so. Now, for example, one major assumption is by good old Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, the lunatic murderer that killed many Native Americans for no reason, who noticed that ships dip beneath the horizon mast last when exiting your point of view due to the quote curvature of the earth. An important point I should interject is that distant ships should experience about double droppage if we lived on a globe, because not only would they be going down a curve, but the laws or the operations of perspective would still apply to that ship, rendering the ship even smaller or lower towards the horizon to the distant observer at the top of that curve, apparently, according to the observer. So, while the 8 inches per mile squared, or 0.666 feet per mile squared of expected curvature is indeed accurate for the expected alleged non-existing curvature itself, an object, say 6 feet tall, will appear very near the ground from, say, a quarter mile away. At this distance, curvature is not really involved, globe model or plane model. So imagine if that same 6 foot object also dropped along a noticeable curve over that quarter mile. This is just an example of a principle that I'm describing, but that 6 foot object would appear even lower a quarter mile away, dropping along a curve, apparently shrinking due to perspective and physically dropping lower than your line of sight much sooner upon a vertically dropping curve than the same object in the distance upon a flat plane, because both perspective and vertical drop would affect our subjective estimation of that object's height or its vanishing point. In other words, and I literally just sort of thought about this today, we could mathematically prove that a building, say 55 miles away across the lake, just Google search Chicago skyline, Joshua Newicki, Grandmere State Park images, or the stupid weatherman saying it's a mirage. And I've used that picture in several videos. Thank you so much, Joshua Newicki, for that great observation and picture. Now, I don't want to get into the mathematics right now, and in fact, there are far better mathematicians than I who would probably have a really good time figuring this up pretty easily. But I suppose I could even get an exact measurement using 3D Studio Max, which is AutoCAD, which I might do. However, the exact numbers and the exact ratios are not necessarily important to the umpteenth degree. However, there is no possible argument against the notion that apparent vertical droppage of distant ships should be roughly doubled or at least increased on a sphere than just the simple operation of perspective. Ergo, mathematically, the Earth is proven a plane simply because we do not see this apparent necessary double dropping effect of objects near the ground, such as ships gaining distance at sea, but these objects near the ground as they gain distance from the observer. Now, thanks so much to Stephen Doss for the question or inspiration which led to this small portion of the video. Seriously, there's so much physical evidence that clearly proves the flat, stationary Earth without any assumptions involved. It's just the plain, simple truth in terms of theoretical models such as the atom, which is essentially the same thing as billions of tiny little solar systems making up the smaller parts of everything, which is indeed all theory. This theory, including atomic weight, certainly does work on paper. It works mathematically or in theory. However, it's another one of those things that'll never be verified, tested, or falsified. So we just assume it's true because the numbers work, and never deem it necessary to confirm any of the fundamental pillars of theoretical physics, which must entail fully subscribing to unproven assumptions, aka conjecture, without the need or want for some reason to verify the assumptions, and in fact the shunning and ridicule of any evidence that happens to debunk or falsify these assumptions. Now, I believe it's possible for vortex based mathematics to describe atomic weight just as adequately as the standard atomic model, which is essentially the same thing as a solar system model, as ironic as a thing can be, eh? The ancient Greeks believed all things were made of four elements: earth, fire, wind, and water, if I'm not mistaken. I could be off on that, but I believe that's the case. There was some ancient Greek philosopher who believed the elements made up all things were earth, wind, air, and fire, or something like that. Um, but jumping back to vortex-based mathematics real quick, I think it is also going to be a good way to describe or model out the flat Earth. At any rate, in terms of the earth, wind, fire, and water, according to the science of the time, the lyrical hyperbole or the theoretical physics of the time, now we call them philosophers, but according to the science of the time, that everything was made of earth, wind, fire, and water was the truth because it was sort of the agreed upon consensus according to the professional academics and specialists in astronomy, technically astrology in ancient terms, but also in contemporary terms, technically in the form of Catholicism, and even, what's your sign? I'm a Pisces. That's astrology, and I think that there's certainly a difference between astronomy and astrology. However, ancient astronomy was where they developed astrology, which is the zodiac signs and all of the pretty little constellations. And again, I do want to clarify here. I do not believe that some supernatural being placed the constellations in the specific order that they need to be constellations. I believe that they are random stars that we clever humans just so happen to categorize as, familiar things just so that we can keep track of all of the, countless stars in the night sky. So, just have to be clear on that because there are people who will put words in my mouth and say that I claim that some supernatural being physically invented the constellations so that we would navigate the seas, but I digress. Um, and one thing I wanted to do real quick is to apply the same logic of slight divergent angle. So again, in this diagram here, you've got the black line as the perfectly vertical baseline, and the red line as the 2-degree divergent line. Now, again, I'm using 2 degrees because this is a very much a scaled down example. We don't have miles and miles of screen, certainly not 4,000 miles of screen, but suppose, and again, you could play around with these numbers a bit. I mean, this total distance here, we'll say it's about 50 miles from horizon to horizon. Say that we're standing here 50 miles away from the city skyline, and the building here, directly in the center, we'll call it building A, being the primary building. That building would be directly within your line of sight, and so we would call that sort of the baseline, and that would be your black line in these diagrams. Now, a point of contention to me, and perhaps there needs to be some further explanation, but Globers claim that you shouldn't notice buildings tilting over because of curvature. However, I disagree. And the reason that I disagree is, like, again, say you're viewing this skyline, and again, we're assuming the Earth to be a sphere, and of course, this curvature is exaggerated a little bit because, again, I don't have an Earth sized screen, and so we have to sort of imagine what the world would look like if it actually was a sphere. And so the primary building here, building A, would be perfectly perpendicular to the horizon according to you. However, if the building, which is the same height to the left, is 25 miles to the left, and the building to the right is 25 miles to the right, Again, there should be a 25-mile decline on either side of that primary structure. We'll call the one on the left B and the one on the right C. Now, that decline on both sides of the skyscraper would curve down, according to you, down to the left, down to the right, 125 miles to the left, 125 miles to the right. And according to the 8 inches per mile squared, or 0.666 feet per mile squared, each of those buildings should be about 416 feet lower than the primary structure, or structure A, according to your point of view, about 50 or 60 miles away. Now, if you were, say, standing directly in front of the building on the far right, or building C, then building A on the far left should be 1,666 feet down a curve towards the building on the far left, and vice versa. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this quick video. If I could remind all of my loved and respected subscribers to please don't forget to subscribe to my second and third channels, the Morgile 2 and Jonathan Christopoulos. And again, the reason I've done this is to upload longer videos to the tertiary channel and do my live weekly, now twice a weekly, hangouts on the other channel. So just don't forget, there's actually, they're featured on my main channel here, the Morgile, but I'll put links in the description to the other two channels, so don't forget to subscribe. And as always, if you would like to contribute to this channel, you can do so via PayPal to johnelance@gmail.com, or directly via YouTube fan funding. There's a support button on my YouTube homepage. Thanks so much for joining. Everyone, God bless you. As always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace.
Funky bass, Johnny. All right, E-Town comes down. Funky bass, Johnny.
Hearing the music is just like seeing the colors of trance and feeling the power
Funky
of
bass,
acid.
Johnny.
Trance and acid. Trance and acid. And acid. Trance and acid.
All right, E-Town comes down.
is just like seeing the colors of trance and feeling the power of acid. Trance and
gravitational wave, but in fact it was a gravitational wave. And we've convinced ourselves that's the case, and we're here to announce that today. Most precise measuring device, 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 precise measuring device ever built.